Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death of the Eastern Front. Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a woman whose name would become legend across two continents, whose rifle spoke with deadly precision through the smoke and chaos of the Second World War's Eastern Front, and whose courage would challenge every preconception about women in combat. Her story takes us from the streets of a Ukrainian town, through the bloodied ruins of Odessa and Sevastopol, across the ocean to the halls of American power, and into the quiet years that followed the thunder of war. It is a story of transformation, of a young woman who became one of history's most effective soldiers, and of the complex legacy she left behind. Settle in now, as we journey back to a world on the edge of catastrophe, to follow the remarkable life of the woman who would be called Lady Death. The making of a marksman. In the summer of 1916, as the Great War raged across Europe and the Russian Empire trembled on the edge of revolution, a daughter was born to Elena and Mikhail Pavlichenko in the town of Bila Tserkva, in what was then part of the Russian Empire and would later become Ukraine. They named her Lyudmila Mikhailovna, a name that would one day be spoken with reverence by her comrades and with fear by her enemies. The world into which Lyudmila was born was one of profound upheaval. Within months of her birth, the Russian Revolution would begin its violent course, sweeping away centuries of imperial rule and replacing it with something entirely new and uncertain. The young Lyudmila would grow up not in the old world of the Tsars, but in the bold, often brutal experiment of the Soviet Union. When Lyudmila was still a small child, her family moved to Kiev, the ancient capital of Ukraine, a city of golden domes and wide boulevards, of culture and learning. Here, along the banks of the Dnieper River, in this city that had witnessed Vikings and Mongols, princes and revolutionaries, Lyudmila would spend her formative years. By all accounts, young Lyudmila was not a child who fit easily into expected roles. She was headstrong, competitive, fiercely independent. In school, she excelled, showing particular aptitude for subjects that required precision and focus. But it was outside the classroom that her true character began to reveal itself. She was, as she would later recall, a tomboy who preferred climbing trees and engaging in rough play with boys to the quieter pursuits deemed more appropriate for girls of her era. The young Soviet state, for all its many contradictions and cruelties, did promote a certain vision of gender equality, at least in theory. Women were encouraged to work, to study, to participate in building the new socialist society. This was the air that Lyudmila breathed, the ideology that shaped her understanding of what was possible. She would not be told, as girls in many other nations might have been, that certain doors were closed to her simply because of her sex. When Lyudmila was 14 years old, something happened that would alter the trajectory of her life, though she could not have known it at the time. A shooting club opened near her neighborhood, and some of her male classmates began to attend, boasting afterward about their marksmanship. Lyudmila, never one to let boys claim superiority in anything, decided she would join as well. One can imagine her that first day at the shooting range, a slender teenage girl among a group of boys, all of them probably assuming she would prove hopeless with a rifle. The shooting instructor, too, may have had his doubts. But when Lyudmila picked up the rifle, settled it against her shoulder, peered down the sights, and fired, something extraordinary happened. She was good. Not just adequate, but genuinely talented. Marksmanship is a skill that requires many qualities. Steady hands, certainly, but also keen eyesight, the ability to judge distance and wind, and above all, patience and the capacity to remain calm under pressure. The mind must be clear and focused, the breathing controlled. In many ways, it is as much a mental discipline as a physical one. Lyudmila possessed all these qualities in abundance. She returned to the shooting club again and again. While other aspects of her teenage life continued, her studies, her friendships, the normal concerns of a young person growing up, she devoted increasing time to honing her skill with a rifle. She joined a local marksmanship organization, part of the Osoaviakim, a Soviet paramilitary organization that provided pre-military training to civilians. Here, she received more formal instruction, learning not just how to shoot accurately, but the principles of ballistics, the maintenance of weapons, the various factors that could affect a bullet's flight. Lyudmila was not simply playing at being a marksman. She approached it with deadly seriousness, the same intensity she brought to everything she undertook. On the ranges around Kiev, she practiced for hours, learning to shoot from various positions, prone, kneeling, standing. She learned to shoot in different weather conditions, at different times of day, as light changed and shadows shifted. She learned to adjust for wind, for the slight differences between weapons, for the countless variables that can mean the difference between a hit and a miss. By the time she was in her late teens, Lyudmila had become an expert shot, winning local competitions and earning recognition within the Osoaviakim. But she was not merely a competitive shooter. She was learning skills that would prove valuable in a very different context than the peaceful shooting ranges of peacetime Kiev. In 1937, at the age of 21, Lyudmila graduated from high school and enrolled at Kyiv University, choosing to study history. This decision tells us something about her mind, her intellectual curiosity. While she excelled at the physical discipline of marksmanship, she was also drawn to the life of the mind, to understanding the great sweep of human events, the rise and fall of civilizations, the forces that shape societies. Her years at university were productive ones. She threw herself into her studies with the same determination she brought to shooting. She married a fellow student, though this union would prove brief. They would divorce before long, though not before Lyudmila gave birth to a son. Being a young single mother while pursuing a university degree was not easy, but Lyudmila managed it, supported by her own family and by the Soviet system's provision of childcare for working and studying mothers. Throughout her university years, Lyudmila continued her involvement with shooting. She joined the Kyiv University Shooting Club and continued to compete. By now, she was not just skilled, but truly exceptional, one of the finest marksmen in the region. She had developed an almost intuitive understanding of how to place a shot exactly where she wanted it, an ability that seemed almost uncanny to those who watched her shoot. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was a nation living under the shadow of Joseph Stalin's Great Terror. Millions were arrested, executed, or sent to the Gulag. The Red Army itself was devastated by purges that eliminated thousands of experienced officers. It was a time of fear and paranoia when anyone might be denounced and disappeared. Yet life went on. Young people still studied, still fell in love, still made plans for their futures. Lyudmila, focusing on her studies and her shooting, may have managed to maintain a certain distance from the worst of the terror, but she could not have been unaware of it. The empty chairs in university lecture halls, the whispered conversations that stopped when strangers approached, the pervasive sense that danger might come from anywhere. These were part of the fabric of Soviet life in those years. As the 1930s drew to a close, however, a different shadow was growing, one that would ultimately affect not just the Soviet Union, but the entire world. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had risen to power, and his ambitions were becoming increasingly clear. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. The Soviet Union, bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, occupied eastern Poland and the Baltic states. But many observers understood that the non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was merely a temporary arrangement. That conflict between these two totalitarian powers was likely inevitable. Lyudmila was 24 years old in 1940, in her final year of university, focused on completing her history degree. She had become, by this point, one of the finest marksmen in Ukraine. She had won numerous competitions and had even achieved the rank of master marksman. But her shooting remained as yet merely a sport and a hobby. She had never fired a weapon at another human being. That was all about to change. The storm breaks. On June 22, 1941, in the early hours of a summer morning, German forces crossed the Soviet border in a massive invasion. Operation Barbarossa, as the Germans called it, was one of the largest military operations in history. Nearly 4 million Axis troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed into Soviet defenses along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The attack caught the Soviet Union woefully unprepared. Stalin, who had ignored numerous warnings of the impending invasion, had left his forces vulnerable. In the first days and weeks of the invasion, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. German forces raced eastward, conquering vast territories and driving toward Moscow. In Kiev, as news of the invasion spread, the mood shifted from shock to grim determination. The city mobilized for war. Young men rushed to join the army. Factories began converting to military production. And Lyudmila Pavlichenko, 24 years old, a history student and master marksman, made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She went to the Red Army recruiting office to volunteer for service. We can imagine the scene. A young woman, slender and determined, presenting herself at the recruiter's desk and announcing her intention to fight. The recruiter, seeing an educated woman, urged her to become a nurse. It was the standard response. Women could serve the war effort, certainly, but in roles that fit traditional expectations. Healing the wounded, that was appropriate. Fighting, killing, that was men's work. But Lyudmila had not come to be a nurse. She had come to fight, and she had the credentials to prove she could. She informed the recruiter of her marksmanship record, her master marksman ranking, her years of training. Still, there was skepticism. Could this young woman really shoot as well as she claimed? Would she truly be able to function in combat, to actually kill enemy soldiers? To prove her point, Lyudmila demonstrated her skill right there at the recruiting office, likely at a nearby range. And her performance left no room for doubt. She could shoot, and shoot well. The Red Army, desperate for every capable soldier in these catastrophic early weeks of the invasion, could not afford to turn away someone with her abilities. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was assigned to the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. She was issued a Mosin Nagant rifle, the standard weapon of the Soviet sniper. The Mosin Nagant was a bolt-action rifle that had been in service since the 1890s. It was not the most sophisticated weapon, but it was reliable, accurate, and well suited to the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. Equipped with a PE or PU scope, in the hands of a skilled marksman, it was deadly at ranges up to 800 meters or more. Lyudmila was also issued the distinctive uniform of a Soviet soldier. Denunciat, gymnasterka tunic, charivari trousers, a pilotka side cap, and boots. Later, she would be provided with a camouflage suit for concealment. She was officially a private in the Red Army, one soldier among millions, but carrying a weapon that would make her far deadlier than most. The 25th Rifle Division was sent south toward Odessa, the great port city on the Black Sea. By the time Lyudmila arrived in the region in early August, German and Romanian forces were already advancing toward the city. Odessa was strategically vital, a major naval base and commercial port, and one of the Soviet Union's most important cities. If it fell quickly, as so many other Soviet cities had fallen in the first weeks of the invasion, it would be a major blow. But Odessa would not fall quickly. The Soviet defenders, a mix of Red Army units, sailors from the Black Sea Fleet, and local militia, prepared to make a stand. They fortified the city's approaches, dug trenches, laid minefields, and waited for the enemy to come. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, this would be her baptism of fire, her first taste of real combat. No amount of training, no number of competitions or practice sessions could truly prepare someone for the reality of war. Soon she would discover whether she had the strength not just to shoot accurately, but to shoot to kill, to take a human life through the crosshairs of her scope. Baptism of fire. The siege of Odessa began in earnest in early August 1941. Romanian forces, allied with Nazi Germany, bore the primary responsibility for the assault on the city. German units provided support, but it was the Romanians who would do most of the fighting and dying in the attempt to capture Odessa. The defenders of Odessa had prepared as well as circumstances allowed. The city was ringed with defensive positions, trenches, bunkers, artillery emplacements, anti-tank ditches cut across the approaches, barbed wire stretched across no man's land. And scattered throughout these defenses in carefully selected positions were Soviet snipers, including the newly arrived Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Lyudmila was assigned to a forward position where she would have a clear field of fire over the approaches to the Soviet lines. A sniper's position required careful preparation. She would have needed to find a spot that offered good visibility while providing cover and concealment. Perhaps a ruined building, a shell crater, a carefully camouflaged hide dug into the earth. The position needed to be stable enough to shoot from, but not so obvious that it would draw enemy fire or, worse, enemy snipers. Sniping is, in many ways, a lonely profession. While other soldiers fight together, advancing in groups, supporting each other directly, a sniper typically works alone or with a single spotter. The work requires patience above all. Hours, sometimes days, of watching and waiting for the right shot, the right target. It requires iron discipline to remain still and silent, even when cold, hungry, or terrified. And it requires the mental fortitude to kill deliberately, personally, watching another human being through a magnified scope and then ending their life with a single shot. Lyudmila would later recall her first kill. She saw a Romanian soldier moving carelessly through her sector. She tracked him through her scope, calculated the distance, adjusted for wind. Her finger tightened on the trigger. And then, in that moment before firing, she hesitated. This was not a paper target on a peaceful range in Kiev. This was a human being, someone with a life, a family, dreams of his own. Could she really do this? Could she really kill? The moment stretched. The Romanian soldier continued his movement, unaware of the crosshairs centered on him. And then Lyudmila thought of the invasion of her homeland, of the cities burning, of the civilians being killed and enslaved by the advancing fascists. She thought of her son, her family, her fellow soldiers, and she pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the soldier fall. Her first kill. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer simply a marksman, a competitive shooter. She was now a soldier who had killed in combat. But there was no time to dwell on it. The siege of Odessa would last 73 days, and those would be 73 days of almost continuous combat. Enemy attacks came in waves, trying to break through the Soviet defenses. Soviet forces counterattacked, trying to throw the besiegers back. Artillery thundered constantly, aircraft droned overhead, and through it all, snipers on both sides plied their deadly trade. Lyudmila quickly established herself as an extraordinarily effective sniper. Day after day, she added to her tally of kills. She developed routines, learned the rhythms of the battlefield, came to understand when opportunities would present themselves. She learned to spot careless movement, to identify officers and valuable targets like artillery spotters and machine gun crews. She learned the enemy's habits, their mistakes. A sniper must be a keen observer of human nature. Soldiers follow patterns, take the same routes, make the same mistakes. They smoke cigarettes that can be seen from hundreds of meters away. They stand when they should crouch. They peer over cover at predictable intervals, and when they do, a sniper is waiting. Lyudmila also learned the harsh realities of the sniper's profession. The enemy had snipers too, and they were hunting her just as she hunted them. Every time she took a shot, she revealed her position through the muzzle flash and the sound. She had to shoot and move, never staying in one position too long. She learned to set up false positions, to draw enemy fire to empty locations while she waited elsewhere. She learned that survival as a sniper required not just shooting skill, but craftiness, patience, and constant vigilance. The fighting at Odessa was brutal and unforgiving. The Romanians, despite suffering heavy casualties, pressed their attacks with determination. They knew, as did the Soviets, that time was not on the defenders' side. Eventually, the city would be cut off completely. Supplies would dwindle and it would have to fall. But the Soviets were determined to hold as long as possible, to tie down enemy forces that might otherwise be used elsewhere, to make the enemy pay in blood for every meter of ground. In this cauldron of violence, Lyudmila became not just an effective soldier, but a deadly one. Her kill count climbed steadily. 10 kills, 20, 30. Each one represented a moment of perfect clarity, of controlled breathing and steady hands, and a trigger pressed at exactly the right instant. Each one represented an enemy soldier who would never fire another shot, who would never harm another Soviet citizen. But each kill also took a toll. The popular image of the emotionless sniper, coldly racking up kills without feeling, is largely a myth. Most snipers, even the most effective ones, struggle with the psychological weight of what they do. They kill not in the heat of battle, not in self-defense as enemies charge toward them, but deliberately, personally, watching the target before and sometimes after the shot. It requires a kind of compartmentalization, a way of separating the act of killing from one's normal self. Lyudmila would later speak of how she managed this burden. She reminded herself constantly of why she was fighting, of what the fascist invaders had done and would do to her country and her people. She saw herself not as a murderer, but as a defender, each shot a contribution to the liberation of her homeland. This framing, this sense of purpose, helped her to continue doing what was necessary. As the siege wore on, conditions in Odessa became increasingly difficult. Supplies were limited, reaching the city only by sea. And even those supply lines were under constant threat from enemy aircraft and submarines. Food became scarce. Ammunition had to be conserved. Medical supplies dwindled, leaving the wounded to suffer with inadequate treatment. The civilian population, trapped in the besieged city, endured hunger, fear, and the constant bombardment. Yet morale among the defenders remained remarkably high. They were determined to prove that the Red Army could fight, could hold ground, could make the enemy pay. After the catastrophic defeats of the war's first weeks, Odessa became a symbol of Soviet resistance. And within the garrison, young Lyudmila Pavlichenko was becoming something of a legend. Other snipers, other soldiers, began to hear about this woman who was racking up an impressive kill count. In the Soviet military culture of the time, successful snipers were celebrated, their achievements publicized to boost morale. Lyudmila's commanders noted her success, and her name began to appear in reports, in newsletters, circulated among the troops. By early October 1941, Lyudmila had killed 187 enemy soldiers at Odessa. It was an extraordinary number, achieved in just 2 months of combat. She had proven herself not just capable, but exceptional, one of the most effective snipers in the Red Army. But her time at Odessa was coming to an end. The Soviet High Command had decided that Odessa could no longer be held. The city was needed elsewhere, specifically at Sevastopol, another major port on the Crimean Peninsula that was also under threat. In mid-October, under cover of darkness, the Red Army executed a masterful evacuation of Odessa. The garrison, including Lyudmila's unit, was transported by ship across the Black Sea to Sevastopol. It was a tactical retreat, but strategically sound. The defenders of Odessa had accomplished their mission, tying down enemy forces for more than 2 months and inflicting heavy casualties. Now they would make another stand, in an even more important location, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko would continue her war, her rifle ready, her resolve unshaken. The siege of Sevastopol was one of the most important naval bases in the Soviet Union, home to the Black Sea Fleet, and a city of immense strategic significance. Built on steep hills overlooking a deep natural harbour, the city was almost a fortress by geography alone. But in the autumn of 1941, as German forces advanced through Crimea, that fortress would face the most severe test imaginable. The defenders of Sevastopol set about preparing for the coming siege with grim determination. They constructed extensive fortifications, bunkers, trenches, artillery positions, all protected by minefields and barbed wire. The hills surrounding the city were turned into defensive strongpoints. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. The Black Sea Fleet provided both supplies and naval gunfire support. Lyudmila and her fellow evacuees from Odessa were quickly integrated into Sevastopol's defenses. She was assigned to the defense of Hill 77, later known as Sniper Hill, because of the concentration of Soviet snipers deployed there. From this position, she would have a commanding view over the approaches to the city, perfect terrain for a sniper's work. The siege of Sevastopol would last far longer than Odessa. 250 days of almost continuous combat, from October 1941 to July 1942. It would be one of the longest and bloodiest sieges of the entire war, consuming countless lives on both sides in a battle that turned the hills around Sevastopol into a charnel house. The fighting was different from Odessa in several ways. The German forces attacking Sevastopol were more numerous, better equipped, and more tactically sophisticated than the Romanians who had assaulted Odessa. The Germans brought in massive siege artillery, including some of the largest guns ever built to bombard the city's fortifications. Air attacks were constant and devastating. The defenders faced not just infantry assaults, but coordinated combined arms operations of a kind the Romanians had never managed. For Lyudmila, the siege of Sevastopol represented both her greatest achievements and her greatest challenges as a sniper. The intensity of combat was higher than anything she had experienced at Odessa. There were more targets, but also more danger. The Germans, learning of the effectiveness of Soviet snipers, deployed their own highly trained sharpshooters to hunt the hunters. A deadly game developed on the hills around Sevastopol, a contest between opposing snipers. German snipers would try to locate and eliminate Soviet snipers, while Soviet snipers did the same in reverse. These duels could last for days, with each side trying to outwit and outpatient the other. A moment of carelessness, a pattern revealed, a position given away, and death would arrive in the form of a high-velocity bullet. Lyudmila engaged in several such duels during the siege. She would later recount some of these encounters, describing the tense stalking, the careful observation, the sudden opportunity, and the shot that ended it. These sniper versus sniper engagements required everything she had learned, every skill she possessed. She was not simply hunting careless soldiers anymore. She was hunting trained killers who were specifically looking for her. One encounter would become particularly famous in Soviet accounts. Lyudmila spotted a German sniper who had been particularly effective, who had killed several Soviet soldiers. She observed his position, noted his patterns, and planned her move. For 3 days she tracked him, learning his habits, waiting for the perfect moment. And then, when he made a slight error, perhaps standing a fraction higher than he should have, or moving at a predictable time, she took her shot. The German sniper fell, and Lyudmila survived. These encounters were not just about skill, but about psychological warfare. Snipers on both sides tried to unsettle each other, to make their opponents nervous and prone to mistakes. Lyudmila developed a reputation among German forces, a reputation that was both a source of pride and a source of danger. They called her Lady Death, recognition of her deadly effectiveness. But that reputation also meant that eliminating her became a priority for German snipers. Through the autumn and winter of 1941-42, as snow fell on the hills of Sevastopol and the fighting continued with barely a pause, Lyudmila's kill count continued to climb. By December, she had passed 200 confirmed kills. By early 1942, she had passed 250. Each number represented not just a successful shot, but a battle survived, a day or week or month of grueling combat endured. The conditions under which she fought were extraordinarily harsh. Winter on the Black Sea coast, while milder than in northern Russia, was still cold, wet, and miserable. Snipers had to remain still for hours, sometimes in the snow, sometimes in the mud, always exposed to the elements. Food was often scarce. Sleep came in brief, irregular intervals. The constant stress of combat, of knowing that at any moment a bullet might find you, wore on everyone. Lyudmila also had to cope with the psychological burden of her mounting kill count. Over 250 human beings had died because she had pulled her trigger. 250 lives ended. 250 families who would never see their sons or husbands or fathers again. Yes, they were enemy soldiers, invaders of her homeland, servants of a regime bent on genocide and enslavement. Yes, their deaths saved Soviet lives, contributed to the defense of her country, but they were still human beings, still people. The weight of that, even for someone as strong-willed as Lyudmila, must have been immense. She found various ways to cope. The camaraderie of her fellow soldiers helped. She was not alone, but part of a community united in common purpose. The discipline of her craft helped. Too, the focus required to be an effective sniper left little room for excessive introspection while on duty. And the righteousness of her cause helped most of all. She believed deeply and genuinely that she was fighting for survival, for her nation, for a better world. That belief sustained her through the worst moments. As the siege continued into the spring of 1942, the intensity of combat reached new heights. The Germans, frustrated by their inability to capture the city quickly, poured more resources into the assault. Giant siege guns pounded Sevastopol day and night. Waves of bombers darkened the sky. Infantry assaults came with increasing frequency and ferocity. The Soviet defenders, their numbers dwindling, their supplies running low, fought with desperate courage. Every hill, every building, every trench was contested. The casualty rates on both sides were staggering, and through it all the snipers continued their deadly work, Lyudmila among them. In June 1942, disaster struck Lyudmila personally. She was wounded by mortar fire, taking shrapnel to her face and body. The wounds were not immediately life-threatening, but they were serious enough to require medical attention and, more significantly, serious enough that her commanders decided she could no longer remain at the front. By this point, Lyudmila had achieved 309 confirmed kills, making her one of the most successful snipers in military history. Her superiors recognized that she was now more valuable as a symbol, as a tool for propaganda and morale, than as one more rifle on the increasingly desperate front lines of Sevastopol. The decision was made to evacuate her from the city. In late June, as German forces closed in and the final fall of Sevastopol became inevitable, Lyudmila was placed on a submarine that slipped out of the harbour under cover of darkness. She left behind her comrades, many of whom would die in the final days of the siege, which fell on July 4th, 1942. Lyudmila's combat career was over. She would never again peer through a rifle scope at an enemy soldier. But her war was far from finished. In fact, she was about to embark on a very different kind of mission, one that would take her far from the battlefields of the Eastern Front and into the realm of international diplomacy and propaganda. Journey to the West. As Lyudmila recovered from her wounds in a hospital in the Soviet rear, her superiors were making plans for her future. The war was not going well for the Soviet Union in the summer of 1942. German forces were driving deep into southern Russia, advancing toward the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. The Eastern Front consumed vast resources, and Soviet casualties were mounting to horrific levels. The Soviet leadership was keenly aware that they needed more support from their Western allies. Britain was already at war with Germany, and the United States had entered the war following Pearl Harbor in December 1941. But the opening of a second front in Western Europe, which would relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, seemed distant. American and British supplies were arriving through the Lend-Lease program, but Stalin wanted more supplies, more equipment, and above all, a second front that would force Germany to divide its forces. The Soviet government decided to send a delegation to the United States and Britain to raise support for the Soviet cause, to generate sympathy and understanding, and to press for more assistance. And they decided that this delegation should include Lyudmila Pavlichenko. The decision made sense from a propaganda perspective. Lyudmila was a genuine war hero, with a record that was undeniable and impressive. She was young, intelligent, and articulate. And she was a woman, which made her story all the more remarkable and attention-getting in societies where women did not serve in combat roles. She could be presented as both a symbol of Soviet determination and as an individual with a compelling personal story. In August 1942, Lyudmila, along with two other Soviet delegates, a man and another female soldier, departed the Soviet Union on a long journey that would take them across the Arctic to Britain and then across the Atlantic to the United States. It was an extraordinary transition for someone who, just weeks before, had been crouching in a trench on the Crimean Peninsula, rifle in hand, watching for enemy targets. The delegation arrived first in Britain, where they met with officials and gave speeches. But the main destination was the United States, and it was there that Lyudmila would make her greatest impact as a spokesman for the Soviet cause. The group arrived in the United States in late August 1942, landing in Washington, D.C. They were received with considerable fanfare. Americans were curious about these Soviet visitors, especially about the young woman sniper who had killed over 300 enemy soldiers. The press descended on the delegation, eager for interviews and photographs. Lyudmila was 25 years old, a continent away from home, thrust into a world utterly foreign to her. She was used to the harsh simplicity of the front lines, to the direct brutality of war. Now she found herself at diplomatic receptions, press conferences, formal dinners. She had to navigate a culture she barely understood, speaking through interpreters, trying to convey her message while also managing her own fatigue, her wounds not fully healed, and the psychological toll of everything she had been through. The American press coverage of Lyudmila was a mixed blessing. On one hand, journalists were genuinely impressed by her military record and her composure. On the other hand, they often focused on aspects of her appearance and her femininity in ways that must have been frustrating. Reporters commented on what she was wearing, whether she used makeup, whether she looked feminine enough. These questions reflected the attitudes of the time, the difficulty many Americans had reconciling the idea of a woman as an effective combat soldier. Lyudmila handled these questions with varying degrees of patience. Sometimes she answered politely, explaining that she wore a uniform, not fashionable dresses, because she was a soldier. Other times her frustration showed through. She had not come to America to discuss fashion. She had come to talk about the war, about the sacrifices the Soviet people were making, about the need for a second front. The delegation's tour took them across America. They visited factories, gave speeches, met with labor groups and political organizations. Everywhere, the message was the same. The Soviet Union was fighting desperately against fascism, and it needed more support from its allies. The second front must be opened. More supplies must be sent. The war against Hitler was a common struggle, and it required a common effort. One of the most significant moments of Lyudmila's time in America came in Chicago when she addressed a gathering of trade union members. Her speech on that occasion has become famous, remembered particularly for one searing passage. Speaking through an interpreter, she addressed herself to the men in the audience. "Gentlemen," she said, "I am 25 years old and I have already killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" It was a direct challenge, delivered with conviction. The message was clear. While Soviet women were fighting and dying, where were the American and British forces? When would the second front be opened? When would the full might of the Western Allies be brought to bear against Germany? The audience reportedly responded with stunned silence, and then with thunderous applause. It was exactly the kind of moment the Soviet delegation had hoped for. Lyudmila, a young woman who had proven her courage beyond any doubt, calling out the delays and hesitations of the Western powers. During her time in America, Lyudmila also met with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, and a figure of considerable influence in her own right. Eleanor Roosevelt was known for her progressive politics and her advocacy for various social causes. She took an interest in Lyudmila, seeing in her both a symbol of women's capabilities and an individual with a fascinating story. The two women formed something of a friendship, as much as was possible, given the brief time available and the barriers of language and culture. Eleanor Roosevelt invited Lyudmila to stay at the White House, showed her around Washington, and helped to arrange meetings and speeches. After Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union, they corresponded, and Eleanor Roosevelt would later visit the Soviet Union and meet with Lyudmila again. Lyudmila's tour of America lasted several weeks. She gave numerous speeches, conducted countless interviews, and met with a wide variety of people. She visited American is harder to judge. The Second Front would not be opened until June 1944, with the D-Day landings in Normandy. But the Lend-Lease supplies continued to flow, and American public opinion remained generally supportive of the Soviet alliance throughout the war. Lyudmila's contribution to maintaining that support should not be discounted. From the United States, the delegation traveled back to Britain for additional appearances, and then returned to the Soviet Union in late 1942. Lyudmila came home to a nation still locked in desperate struggle. The Battle of Stalingrad was raging, and the ultimate outcome of the war remained very much in doubt. But Lyudmila would not return to combat. Her role now was to train other snipers, to pass on her skills and experience to the next generation. She was also to continue to serve as a symbol of Soviet heroism, giving speeches, appearing at rallies, helping to maintain morale. The teacher and the hero. When Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union, in late 1942, the war had entered a critical phase. German forces had reached Stalingrad on the Volga River and were fighting a brutal battle for control of the city. The outcome of that battle would prove to be one of the war's great turning points. But that outcome was not yet clear, and the Soviet Union remained in mortal danger. Lyudmila, her combat days behind her, was assigned to train snipers at a specialized school. It was vital work. Snipers had proven their value on the Eastern Front, and the Red Army needed more of them, as many as could be trained. Lyudmila had the credentials and the experience to be an excellent instructor. Teaching sniping is more complex than simply showing someone how to shoot accurately. Yes, marksmanship is fundamental, and Lyudmila could certainly teach that. But effective sniping requires so much more. It requires understanding of ballistics and the effects of weather, wind, and distance. It requires knowledge of camouflage and concealment, of how to select and prepare a position. It requires understanding of infantry tactics, of where to find targets and when to shoot. Most of all, perhaps, it requires the right mindset. A sniper must be patient, disciplined, and able to cope with the psychological demands of the role. Not everyone has the temperament for it. Lyudmila, drawing on her own experience, could help aspiring snipers understand what they were getting into and prepare them mentally as well as technically. She trained hundreds of snipers over the following months and years. Some of them would go on to distinguished combat records of their own. In this way, Lyudmila's impact on the war extended beyond her own 309 kills. The snipers she trained would account for many more enemy casualties, and their effectiveness would contribute to the eventual Soviet victory. But training was not Lyudmila's only role. She was also in demand as a speaker and a public figure. She gave lectures to troops, appeared at war bond, rallies, spoke to workers in factories. She was living propaganda, a flesh and blood example of Soviet courage and determination. The state used her extensively for morale purposes, and she seems to have accepted this role, understanding its importance to the war effort. In 1943, Lyudmila was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. The award recognized both her combat achievements and her service to the state since returning from the front. She received the Gold Star Medal and the Order of Lenin. For a woman who had started the war as an unknown history student, this was a remarkable ascent. She also resumed her own studies during this period. Despite the demands on her time, she managed to complete her history degree at Kiev University, which had been evacuated from German-occupied Ukraine to the Soviet interior. She was interested in history not just as an academic subject, but as a way of understanding the great events through which she was living. As the war progressed, the tide slowly turned in the Soviet Union's favor. The victory at Stalingrad in February 1943 was followed by the Great Tank Battle at Kursk in July. By late 1943, the Red Army was advancing westward, liberating Soviet territory and beginning the long, bloody push toward Germany itself. Lyudmila followed these developments with the keen interest of someone who had been part of the early, desperate defense. She knew many of the soldiers who were now fighting in these offensives. Some were men she had trained. Others were comrades from Odessa and Sevastopol who had survived. Many more were dead, buried in mass graves or left on battlefields across the vast expanse of the Eastern Front. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with the German surrender. The Soviet Union had paid a staggering price for victory, perhaps 27 million dead, cities destroyed, entire regions devastated. But it had won. The fascist invader had been defeated, driven back to Berlin, crushed, utterly. For Lyudmila, the victory must have been deeply satisfying, but also profoundly bittersweet. She had contributed to this victory both through her own combat service and through her training and morale work. But so many were gone, so many of those who had fought beside her in those desperate early days. Sevastopol, where she had spent those 8 months of hell, had finally been liberated in May 1944, but at enormous cost. After the war, Lyudmila's life entered a new phase. She was a war hero, a public figure, someone whose name was known throughout the Soviet Union. But she was also a young woman, still in her 20s with a life to rebuild in peacetime. She continued her education, eventually earning a master's degree in history. Her thesis, appropriately enough, focused on the defense of Odessa. She was intimately familiar with her subject matter, of course, having been present for the entire siege. But she approached it as a historian, analyzing the strategic and tactical decisions, the logistics, the political context. It was a way of processing her own experience, of making sense of what she had lived through. Lyudmila also married again to a fellow officer, though this marriage too would eventually end in divorce. She had her career. She worked for the Soviet Navy in a role that drew on her military experience and her public standing. She gave occasional lectures and interviews, though, as the years passed and the immediate post-war period gave way to the Cold War era, the interest in her story somewhat waned. The Cold War years. The post-war years in the Soviet Union were a time of reconstruction, of attempting to rebuild a shattered nation. But they were also a time of increasing tension between the Soviet Union and its former Western allies. The wartime alliance gave way to mutual suspicion and ideological conflict. The Cold War descended like a new kind of iron curtain, dividing Europe and much of the world into competing camps. For Lyudmila, these years were ones of relative stability, but also of fading prominence. During the war, she had been celebrated, her story used to inspire Soviet citizens and impress foreign audiences. In the post-war period, while she remained a respected figure, she was no longer front-page news. New heroes emerged and the focus of Soviet propaganda shifted. She continued her work for the Soviet Navy in what appears to have been largely an administrative or ceremonial role. She was, in essence, a professional war hero, someone whose past service gave her a certain status and position. It was not an unusual trajectory for Soviet war heroes. Many were given sinecures in various institutions, positions that honored their service while not requiring particularly demanding work. Lyudmila also remained involved in various veterans' organizations and committees. She attended commemorations, gave occasional speeches, met with delegations of foreign veterans or guests. She was a link to the war years, a living reminder of the great struggle against fascism. Her personal life during these years is less well documented. She lived in Moscow, in an apartment that was modest by Western standards but comfortable by Soviet ones. She had her son, who was growing up, and she maintained relationships with a circle of friends and fellow veterans. But there were also losses, soldiers she had known who died during the war, friends who passed away in the post-war years. In 1957, Lyudmila had an opportunity to revisit one of the most significant connections from her wartime travels. Eleanor Roosevelt, now no longer First Lady but still a prominent figure, visited the Soviet Union. The two women met again more than a decade after their first meeting in Washington. It was a warm reunion, a connection across the ideological divide of the Cold War. Roosevelt would later write about Lyudmila in her memoirs, describing her as impressive and memorable. The mutual respect between these two very different women, one an American patrician and progressive activist, the other a Soviet soldier and working-class hero, was genuine and lasting. As the 1960s began, Lyudmila was in her 40s, a middle-aged woman living in a society that was itself changing. Stalin had died in 1953, and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, had begun a process of de-Stalinization, acknowledging at least some of the crimes of the Stalin era. The Soviet Union was still authoritarian and repressive, but there was a slight thaw, a bit more room for discussion and dissent than there had been during Stalin's terror. For someone of Lyudmila's generation, these changes were complex to navigate. She had come of age under Stalin, had fought a war in his name, had been shaped by the ideology of her youth. The revelations about Stalin's crimes, though limited, must have been troubling. How to reconcile the heroic narrative of the war years with the growing knowledge of the terror and the purges? There is little evidence of what Lyudmila thought about these questions privately. Publicly, she remained a loyal Soviet citizen, speaking well of her country and its system. But she was also, by all accounts, intelligent and thoughtful. She must have had her private doubts, her own complex feelings about the society she had fought to defend. In 1974, Lyudmila published her memoirs titled The Truth About Women Snipers. The book was part memoir, part defense of the role of women in combat. She wrote about her experiences at Odessa and Sevastopol, about her training methods, about the other female snipers she had known. She also addressed the skepticism and prejudice that female soldiers often faced, arguing forcefully that women could be every bit as effective as men in combat roles. The book was well received in the Soviet Union, though it was never translated into English during Lyudmila's lifetime. It gave her a chance to tell her story in her own words, to control the narrative rather than being a subject of others' propaganda. The writing was straightforward, unsentimental. She was not interested in romanticizing war, only in conveying the reality of what she had experienced and what she had accomplished. The final years. By the 1970s, Lyudmila was approaching 60, a grandmother now, her life well into its later stages. The Soviet Union of this era was a stagnant society, ruled by elderly men in the Kremlin, experiencing economic difficulties and losing ground in the competition with the West. The idealism of the early Soviet years had long since faded, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance of the way things were. Lyudmila's health, never robust after her wartime wounds and the strain of her combat service, was beginning to fail. She suffered from various ailments, the cumulative effect of stress, injuries, and advancing age. She spent more time at home, less involved in public activities, living more quietly. She maintained contact with fellow veterans, with the shrinking circle of those who had survived the war and its aftermath. They would meet these old soldiers and remember the days when they had been young, when everything had seemed to matter so desperately. They had lived through history, had been part of events that shaped the world. That memory was precious, even as it was painful. The 30th anniversary of the end of World War II came in 1975. There were major celebrations throughout the Soviet Union, honoring the veterans, remembering the dead. Lyudmila participated in some of these commemorations, though her failing health limited her activities. It was a bittersweet time, pride in what had been achieved, sorrow for what had been lost, awareness that the generation that had fought the war was passing away. In the late 1970s, Lyudmila's health deteriorated further. The wounds she had suffered at Sevastopol decades earlier, the stress of her combat service, the cumulative effects of a hard life. All of this took its toll. She required increasing medical care, spent more time in hospitals. On October 10, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in Moscow. She was only 58 years old. The official cause of death was stroke, but in a larger sense she died of the war, of what it had done to her body and perhaps to her spirit over more than 3 decades. Her death was noted in the Soviet press. She was buried with military honors in the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, one of the most prestigious burial grounds in the Soviet Union, the final resting place of many famous Russians and Soviets. Her grave was marked with a monument showing her in profile, rifle in hand, forever the soldier. The obituaries praised her as a hero of the Soviet Union, as one of the most effective snipers in history, as a woman who had proven that courage and effectiveness in combat were not the exclusive province of men. Her kill count of 309 was noted, as were her awards and her post-war service. But Lyudmila had been more than just a collection of statistics and medals. She had been a person, a woman with hopes and fears, with relationships and losses, with a life that encompassed far more than those months of combat that defined her public image. The obituaries captured some of that, but much was left unsaid, as is always the case. Legacy and memory. In the years since Lyudmila's death, her story has taken on new dimensions. During the Soviet era, she was remembered primarily as a war hero, an example of Soviet courage and determination. Her story fit neatly into the official narrative of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II, a story of heroic defense, of ultimate victory, of the Soviet people's sacrifice and triumph. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the context changed. The heroic narratives of the Soviet era came under scrutiny. Some veterans felt that their service was being forgotten or denigrated, but others felt freer to tell more complete stories, to acknowledge complexity and ambiguity. Lyudmila's story, interestingly, has remained compelling across this transition. She has been the subject of multiple biographies, both in Russia and in the West. Her military record is well documented and undisputed. 309 confirmed kills makes her one of the top snipers of World War II, male or female. Her intelligence and determination are evident in the historical record, and her significance as a pioneering female combat soldier has only increased as discussions of women's roles in military service have evolved. In Ukraine, where Lyudmila was born and where she first learned to shoot, her memory has been complicated by the post-Soviet geopolitical situation. Ukraine and Russia have had a difficult relationship since Ukrainian independence, a relationship that has included open conflict in recent years. Lyudmila was Soviet, certainly, but she was also Ukrainian, from Bila Tserkva and Kiev. How to remember her in a Ukraine seeking to build a distinct national identity separate from Russia is not simple. In Russia, she remains a hero, her story told to new generations as an example of wartime courage. Her grave in Novodevichy Cemetery is a site of pilgrimage for those interested in military history. On Victory Day, May 9th, when Russians commemorate the end of World War II, flowers are often left at her grave. In the West, Lyudmila's story has gained increasing attention, particularly in recent decades as interest in women's military history has grown. Books and articles about female combatants in World War II almost invariably include her. She is often presented as an example of how women can excel in roles traditionally reserved for men, a pioneer who proved that gender need not determine capability. There has also been increased interest in the technical aspects of her sniping. Military historians and firearms enthusiasts have analyzed her methods, discussed the weapons she used, debated the factors that made her so effective. While such analysis can sometimes miss the human element, it is also a form of respect, taking her seriously as a professional soldier. In 2015, a biographical film about Lyudmila was released in Russia, titled Battle for Sevastopol, also known as Indestructible. The film, while taking some dramatic liberties, brought her story to a new audience. It portrayed her not just as a killing machine, but as a complex person dealing with trauma, loss, and the moral weight of what she had done. The film was controversial in some quarters, with debates about historical accuracy and about whether it romanticized war or appropriately honored a veteran. But it succeeded in keeping Lyudmila's memory alive, in reminding people of her story and her significance. Lyudmila has also been honored in various other ways. Postage stamps have featured her image in both Russia and Ukraine. Museums have exhibits about her. Schools and military units have been named in her honor. These are the typical ways societies remember their heroes, and Lyudmila has received her share of such recognition. But perhaps the most important aspect of Lyudmila's legacy is simply the fact that her story is told at all. So many soldiers, so many millions who fought and died in World War II are forgotten, their names known only to their descendants, if to anyone. Lyudmila, through her remarkable record and through the accidents of history and propaganda, achieved a measure of immortality. Her story challenges us in several ways. It challenges assumptions about women's capabilities in combat. It challenges us to think about the nature of courage, the psychology of killing, the toll of war. It challenges simple narratives about World War II, reminding us that the Eastern Front was a place of terrible violence where ordinary people did extraordinary things, often at great personal cost. Lyudmila's legacy is also a reminder of the role that Soviet women played in World War II more generally. While the Soviet Union was far from a gender-equal society, it did mobilize women for war in ways that few other nations did. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet women served in combat roles as snipers, machine gunners, tank crew members, pilots, anti-aircraft gunners. They fought and died alongside men, and their contribution to the Soviet victory was substantial. Lyudmila was perhaps the most famous of these women, but she was not alone. Her story is part of a larger story about the Soviet Union's desperate mobilization, about the total nature of the war on the Eastern Front, about the immense sacrifices made to defeat Nazi Germany. Reflections on a Sniper's War. As we near the end of our journey through Lyudmila Pavlichenko's life, it is worth reflecting on what her story means, what it tells us about war, about courage, about human nature. Lyudmila was, by any measure, an exceptional person. Her skill as a marksman was extraordinary. Her courage under fire was undeniable. Her ability to cope with the psychological demands of combat sniping, to continue functioning effectively through months of brutal warfare, speaks to immense mental strength. But we should be careful not to romanticize her or her experiences. Sniping is killing, and Lyudmila killed 309 people. Those were not abstract statistics, they were human beings, Yes, they were enemy soldiers, invaders of her homeland, servants of a genocidal regime. Yes, their deaths saved Soviet lives and contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. But they were still people, still men with families and dreams, who died because Lyudmila shot them. Lyudmila herself never claimed to be unaffected by this. In her writings and interviews, she acknowledged the psychological burden. She spoke of nightmares, of memories that haunted her. She dealt with her trauma as best she could, and by all accounts she managed to live a reasonably functional life after the war, but she paid a price, as all soldiers do, for what she experienced and what she did. It is important to remember this because there is a tendency in discussing snipers, particularly famous ones, to focus on the skill, the record, the numbers, while losing sight of the human cost, both to the targets and to the sniper themselves. Lyudmila was not a video game character racking up a high score. She was a person engaged in the deadly serious business of war, doing what she believed necessary to defend her homeland. The question of women in combat is another thread running through Lyudmila's story. Her success challenges the assumption that women are inherently unsuited for combat roles. She was not physically stronger than male soldiers, but she didn't need to be. Sniping does not require great physical strength, but it does require skill, patience, discipline, and psychological resilience, all qualities that have nothing to do with gender. The Soviet Union's willingness to employ women in combat roles was, born partly of necessity, facing an existential threat. They could not afford to limit their manpower to only half the population, and partly of ideology, the communist doctrine of equality. Other nations in World War II generally kept women out of combat positions, with rare exceptions. Since Lyudmila's time, the debate over women in combat has continued. Many nations now allow women to serve in combat roles, though this remains controversial in some places. Lyudmila's record stands as evidence that women can be effective combat soldiers, that gender need not be a barrier to military service. But her story also reminds us that combat is terrible regardless of who is doing it. The question is not really, can women be effective killers? But rather, do we want more people of any gender to experience the trauma of combat? The focus on breaking barriers for women in the military can sometimes obscure the larger question of why we have wars at all, why we need armies, why we continue to settle disputes through violence. Lyudmila lived in a time when these larger questions were largely moot. Nazi Germany had launched a war of conquest and genocide. The Soviet Union faced annihilation. Fighting back was necessary by any means available. In such circumstances, Lyudmila's choice to fight, to use her skills to defend her homeland, was entirely understandable and arguably admirable. But we, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back at the enormity of World War II, perhaps 70 to 85 million dead, countless wounded, entire cities destroyed, civilizations shattered, can also reflect on the madness of it all, the terrible waste, the sorrow. Lyudmila's 309 kills were a drop in the ocean of that war's casualties, but each one was a life ended, a family grief-stricken, a future erased. We can honor Lyudmila's courage and skill while also mourning all those deaths, all those lives cut short, on all sides. Conclusion. And so we come to the end of our story, the story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the girl from Bila Tserkva who became one of history's most effective soldiers, the woman who stared through a rifle scope into the face of death 309 times and never flinched. Hers is a story of transformation, from student to soldier, from novice to expert, from unknown to legend. It is a story of courage, certainly, of facing danger and death with remarkable calmness. It is a story of skill developed through years of practice and honed in the crucible of combat. It is a story of service, of using her abilities for what she believed was a righteous cause. But it is also a story of cost, the physical cost of her wounds, which never fully healed and contributed to her relatively early death. The psychological cost of months of brutal combat, of killing over and over, of seeing comrades die, of living always on the edge of annihilation. The cost of being used as a symbol, as propaganda, of having her story told and retold in ways that served state purposes but may not have fully captured her own experience. Lyudmila died in 1974, but her story lived on. In memorials and histories, in books and films, in the memories of those who knew her or knew of her. Her grave in Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery bears silent witness to a life remarkable and terrible, heroic and tragic. When we remember Lyudmila Pavlichenko, what should we remember? The numbers 309 kills, hero of the Soviet Union, one of the most effective snipers in history. Yes, certainly those are part of her legacy. But we should also remember the person, intelligent, determined, courageous, but also human, vulnerable, capable of doubt and fear and sorrow. We should remember her as a pioneer, a woman who proved that gender need not determine what one can achieve, who broke barriers and challenged assumptions. We should remember her as a defender, someone who stood against invasion and genocide, who fought for her homeland when it faced existential threat. But we should also remember her as a reminder of war's terrible cost, of what combat does to those who experience it, of the weight of taking human life, even in what we believe to be a just cause. Her story should inspire us not to glorify war, but to understand its reality, its necessity in some circumstances, but also its horror. Tonight, we have walked with Lyudmila through her life, from her birth in the waning days of Imperial Russia, through the convulsions of the Soviet experiment, through the crucible of the Great Patriotic War, through her post-war years and her eventual death. We have seen her as a girl learning to shoot, as a young woman entering university, as a soldier in the trenches of Odessa and Sevastopol, as a diplomat in America, as a teacher, as a writer, as a grandmother. We have seen her as someone who lived through extraordinary times and did extraordinary things, who faced challenges that would have broken lesser people and not only survived but excelled. We have seen her as a product of her time and place, but also as someone who transcended those limitations, who made choices and took actions that changed history, if only in small ways. As we conclude this journey, as the night grows late and our story ends, let us remember Lyudmila Pavlichenko with respect and with understanding. Let us honor her courage and her skill, her determination and her sacrifice. Let us learn from her story about war and peace, about courage and fear, about what humans are capable of, for both good and ill. And let us perhaps be grateful that most of us will never face the choices she faced, will never have to do what she did. Let us hope that future generations will live in a world where such courage is not required, where the skills of a sniper are studied only in history books, where the wars that shaped the 20th century are truly part of the past. Lyudmila Pavlichenko lived, fought, suffered, and endured. Her life was remarkable, her legacy endures, and her story, told on this quiet night, reminds us of the complexity of heroism, the reality of war, and the enduring human capacity for both destruction and transcendence. Rest now as we have journeyed together through this remarkable life. The story is told. The night is deep. And somewhere in the soil of Moscow, Beneath a monument showing a young woman with a rifle rests the mortal remains of Lady Death, her wars finally over, her place in history secure. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey tonight. Until we meet again, may you sleep well, may you dream peacefully, and may you remember the stories of those who came before, whose lives and choices shaped the world we now inhabit. Good night.